This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
So, David, I'm not sure whether people are going to listen to this episode when there's so much else going on in the world right now. President Donald Trump is making headlines every day. So is this still a need to talk about the climate and biodiversity crisis today?
Absolutely. I mean, we're facing, to me, an existential crisis with so many other geopolitically related issues going on. But overarching all of this is a crisis on climate change, and we can see the impacts almost daily as well, and nature loss that in some ways will outlast the current geopolitical problems. So we have to find a way to keep talking about it, because I think helping people understand that these are real issues that are ongoing, that need public and particularly political action, it's a key reminder.
Yeah. So I thought maybe we could talk about, in this episode today, how geopolitics is kind of reshaping our environment and how that is affecting the sustainability conversation. And while many of us immediately think that, this can't be good for climate action, for any kind of multilateral action to promote climate conservation, nature conservation, and so on, maybe we should take a step back and see how things can be reframed given the current news cycle. Welcome to Green Pulse, an environmental podcast series at the Straits Times, where we aim to provide you with a unique Southeast Asian perspective to global environmental challenges. My name is Audrey, and I'm your co-host.
And my name is David, and I'm the other co-host.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that have come up recently is a lot of discussions on energy. And we know that energy consumption, especially the burning of fossil fuels, is the main contributor to climate change as we know it today. And even though we're moving away from science, what the science says about burning fossil fuels, I do think that renewable energy has not left people's consciousness entirely. We still do see things like wind power, nuclear energy being talked about in global discussions, although we are not really hearing about them from the climate perspective, right?
Yeah, so if you look at just going on to renewable energy, I mean, that hasn't slowed at all. It hasn't slowed in Australia. It hasn't really slowed that much in Europe, and it's gone like a rocket in China. In the past 4 years, China added more power generation capacity than the US, the entire US grid, basically, in 4 years. And a lot of that is renewable energy. Unfortunately, China's also still building coal-fired power stations, but they're not really used at their full capacity. And the other thing to look at is, I think there's a view that EVs are not taking off, or that they aren't a success. Well, that's just not true. We've seen EVs in Singapore, 45% of all new car sales.
Yeah, that's almost 1 in 2.
In 2025. And in December last year, 2025, EVs were more than a fifth of all new car sales in Europe. In California, it's about 20%. Other parts in the States, they've sort of fallen off. In China, of course, EV sales have been quite high. So that whole ecosystem, plus the building out of fast chargers, particularly in the States. I was just reading a Bloomberg Green report about ultra-fast chargers being installed by the thousands in just last year in 2025 in the US. So I see some positive signs, at least, that it's there. It's just not really being talked about that much. It's just not capturing the headlines.
Definitely. And people are no longer talking about it in terms of, we need renewable energy to help with the climate crisis. They are talking about other things instead, right? So for the renewable energy push in China, I mean, not just solar panels, but also wind turbines, right? In fact, US President Trump singled China's wind turbines out.
Yeah, if you've watched Donald Trump's hour-and-a-half speech in Davos, where he couldn't help himself, he kept going on about windmills, and that China was manufacturing many wind turbines but not really using them. So obviously he's been misadvised, because China is by far the largest producer of wind power.
I loved all the fact checks that came out after his speech.
Yeah, he just clearly has a thing for wind turbines, or windmills in his case.
Yeah. And, even though the federal administration kind of halted the development of some wind projects in the US, I think most of the court orders have been issued to allow these projects to proceed.
3 out of 5 have been allowed to proceed, because they were so close to completion anyway.
Yeah.
And the weird thing is, the US needs that power because of at least to run all these data centers, and more people are buying EVs. So where are you going to get this all this new energy that the US needs? By keeping all these old clunker coal plants running? That's just not going to work. Some of them need to be retrofitted, and that's who's going to pay for that? The government. Nuclear power plants take a long time to build.
Yeah, I do see why people are talking about renewable energy even despite the geopolitical situation now, because fossil fuels are embroiled in their own, there's the whole geopolitics of like supply chains and so on are going to be affected by what's happening between countries in the world now. And renewable energy, if harnessed from within your own borders, could definitely provide some measure of energy security there. But where I see the geopolitics being kind of like an obstacle for greater climate action, especially here in Southeast Asia, will be how is that going to dampen or affect investor confidence to invest in new climate projects, right? In ASEAN, we are talking about the ASEAN power grid. So is, what's happening geopolitically going to reduce some of the investor interest in putting their money into renewable energy projects in the region? I don't think we're seeing the data showing any of that yet, but it's definitely something to keep an eye out on. But also bearing in mind that the US is not the only player. I mean, it is a major and unignorable player in this space, but we do also see a lot more coming up from, like, say, China and also some European investors continuing.
So I think for Southeast Asia, I think a lot of people will look at China. They'll look at how much China has been investing relentlessly in renewable energy just to meet their own power needs, but also because they have an eye to the future. They know the power demand is going to increase. They know that can't all be met by fossil fuels. And China's also got all these climate targets to meet as well. So, and they see all these wonderful wind turbines, battery storage, solar panels, which are all much more affordable these days. It's the age-old story. Southeast Asia just needs to get its policies right and to get over the incumbency of the fossil fuel cartel here, I suppose, is the best way to describe it. That's what's really holding things back. It's not so much Donald Trump and his weird views on wind turbines.
It's like the policy harmonization.
The financials stack up for green energy.
Yeah.
It's just the policy settings are still not quite right. That's what's got to change in this part of the world.
Yeah, and I do think that there is some progress being made. Like, for example, the ASEAN power grid, there's been news, I think, late in December, that, there's some agreement reached between Laos, Thailand, Malaysia and Singapore to transmit electricity. And hopefully we can see that as the grid develops across the region, we can see more of that coming along. But moving on from energy, we should also talk about nature and how nature has been kind of reframed in the current discussions. And of course, the poster child for this discussion would be Greenland, right? I mean, right now, Greenland is in the news because of all the minerals that it has, right? And the US is afraid that other countries will get their hands on it and is now making a bid to own the territory, to the angst of many of the European nations. But I think it shows what I feel that has not really been discussed is what would Greenland, which is one of the 2 ice sheets left on this planet, would look like if the US were to really make a grab for it.
It will still look pretty much the same. It's going to take centuries to millennia for a lot of that ice to melt. And again, there's been a lot of discussion about the rare earth deposits, and there's about at least 3 large rare earth deposits in Greenland. But they haven't been fully exploited because its access is an issue. I think there are 2 large deposits in the ice-free south. There are others further to the north. But it's just cost is an issue. So some people are saying, "Oh, it's great, climate change will melt all the ice and we can get all the mineral resources." But it's not quite that simple because majority of Greenland still is covered in thick ice. And yes, it's melting at over 100 billion tons a year of ice every year. And that will no doubt increase, I guess, certainly in the coming decades. But there's no infrastructure. There's no roads. What are you going to do? Dig under the ice, which is in some places several kilometres thick? So there's a question as to what the real story is here. In this race for resources, will climate change suddenly open up a gold rush? It will for sea lanes, quite clearly. That's already starting to happen. But I think we need a bit of a reality check in terms of Greenland.
But it's not just about, the direct ice melting, right? I think the other things to be wary of would be the feedback loops, right? The loss of the ice, even in some places, could make the warming more intense, right? Because you lose the albedo effect of ice. And how would that affect ocean circulations and so on? So it does worry me.
Oh, it worries me as well. I mean, we've seen in the past couple of years, and particularly in the past 12 months, this whole focus on rare earth and critical minerals. It's been driven in part by China using that as basically as a stick to beat the US. And so the US is now going around to Australia and other places, and obviously looking at Greenland as well, to sew up supplies outside of China. But we need these critical minerals and rare earths also for renewable energy products as well. So there is that climate change and supply chain link there. But the other thing that people sort of seem to forget about is that while there's this rush for the Arctic in particular for resources, they don't really think of the climate risks. So you've just mentioned them there, but a lot of people don't seem to mention or seem to care or understand about rising sea levels, the impact of melting ice and what that means on habitats.
Maybe people should watch The Day After Tomorrow again.
Yes.
Because that was about all the tipping points that have been crossed.
And so, so that's it. So that's what I wanted to mention next. In terms of tipping points, the other one that people seem to forget, and this is the irony of the whole thing, a lot of people don't seem to understand the other side of climate change. It's not just about warming. It can actually disrupt a major global circulation pattern, which will also, if that slows or stops, will also affect this part of the world.
I guess that all boils down to the timescales that we are talking about, right? I mean, now whatever we are seeing, all this posturing is, to meet their own political electoral time cycles, 4 or 5 years, and a lot of the climate change impacts are going to happen way, much longer than that. So I think there's some incompatibility there. And I mean, related to Greenland is also, what's happening on the deep sea mining front, right?
So that's the other thing. Yeah, particularly in the scramble, again, the geopolitical focus on the scramble for resources. People are forgetting also, as you say, about what will happen to the deep sea and to the environment and biodiversity down there. I mean, the US is clearly going to go deep sea mining in its own territory and possibly outside. And once that happens, is that going to trigger a free-for-all?
Yeah. And I think that's a nice segue into, the next point that we could probably touch on would be the movement away from multilateralism. Everyone knows about climate change, nature conservation as being the tragedy of the commons. And to solve a problem like that, you really need all actors to play their part. So what does it mean now that the US has pulled out and many other countries are also slackening their own targets because all their political priorities have gone to meet whatever the US is challenging at that point? So this movement away from multilateralism, I think it's also something that is going to be challenging for how geopolitics is reshaping our environment. We saw that happen at COP30 last year, right? The US didn't show up. They didn't send a high-level delegate to the conference at all. So what is this going to mean for climate? So
climate treaties or climate action they've really benefited from countries coming together. When we saw that in Paris in 2015, that was I would say, that was a peak moment. And getting people together, getting countries together, it has a snowball effect. Everybody's choosing to act, so we should act too. This country's putting in good policies for climate, regulation, emissions targets, and so forth. We should do the same, and businesses will then follow suit. Now, of course, that's starting to fragment, and so we are seeing some slowing of climate action. But I don't think it's all totally doom and gloom, because we're still seeing some countries that are sticking with the plan. They have a longer term view. They look beyond the traditional electoral cycle, and because they're also strong believers in science. So the science is telling them this is what's going to happen in the coming decades. So it makes no sense just to take on a short-term point of view. So then you have climate clubs. You have groups of countries that
a lot of bilateral deals happening now on climate.
Yeah, and Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, mentioned this, maybe not in the context of climate change, but certainly in the terms of be it on defence or security or so forth, working with like-minded countries, but also on trade. I think he was also, so he's looking at China. Now, Canada and China have not been on great terms, but he can see Canada and China can work together, at least in terms on trade and economic issues. and possibly on climate issues too. Why not?
But I mean, on that front, I do think that China has some success stories in it, but I do think that they are not stepping up as much as people had hoped that they would do on the climate front. I know in the lead up to COP last year, because the US had already expressed that it wouldn't be sending a delegation, and some people were wondering if China will step up to, be the adult in the room. But we did not see that happening, right? And even what's happening in China now, we don't really see a lot of discussions about climate change publicly from the officials.
Well, I think we'll get the measure of what their climate policies and targets and ambitions will be in the next couple of months when they unveil the 15th five-year plan.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are some mixed indicators for sure. I think overall the government is trying to drive decarbonisation, but yes, strangely, they still keep building coal-fired power stations. And there's a report that's coming out, I think, the same day that this podcast goes out, showing that China is in its coal construction pipeline is at the highest for several years. So all these coal-fired power stations get built.
But I thought that there was some forecast that China's emissions would be plateauing.
I think they have plateaued. So this is the weird thing. So on the one hand, China's still building all these coal-fired power stations, but the utilization rate is very low because cheaper renewable energy is more and more of it is coming into the system. So it's a bit strange as to why China is doing this. But it does risk locking in coal use for longer. And it may mean although they might have peaked, it might mean that their trajectory to get to carbon neutral, I think by 2060, might be a little less aggressive than people had hoped.
It's definitely something to watch. And I really wonder what this means for smaller countries in regions, for example, ASEAN, when all the big players have really shown that climate change is no longer on their agendas. What does it mean that even if ASEAN decides to come together to work more on climate change? For us, we see most progress on the ASEAN power grid, but then again, as we discussed at the start of this podcast, that is really a lot more about energy security rather than climate change directly. Even what Singapore is doing with, inking a lot of carbon credit partnerships with other countries and continents like Africa and so on. What does that all mean when all the big players are not playing ball?
Yeah, to me also with all these carbon deals, in one way, the long-term benefits can be good if it's forest preservation and replanting, particularly in poorer countries that need that investment, and provided those projects do last as long as in the multi-decades that they're supposed to. Others will say Singapore's just basically buying themselves out of a big problem and not really transitioning their economy.
I don't really
fast
agree
enough.
with that, though. I mean, it is funds that will go to something that would not have otherwise been funded.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And like you said, forests, especially for our region, will be critical. It's not just our region, actually. Look at the tropical forest basins of the world.
Yeah.
I think that would
Africa and so
definitely help in terms of making sure that these lungs of the planet remain standing. I'm just wondering, will that in a way, how would that change things, given that, as we mentioned, that climate change is the tragedy of the commons, and what's happening even in the Arctic would have implications for us here on the equator. So I don't think that this move from multilateralism to bilateralism is going to be great for the environment. This momentum it has slowed, but hopefully hasn't stopped completely.
So my big concern is we're in a bit of a down period. Climate and particularly nature, they go through these cycles of governments pay a lot of attention and things happen, and then other developments or a bigger war or a very anti-climate US president comes in, and then the news cycle goes down again. I'm wondering what will it take for these issues to come back to be front and center of people's minds. And right now, it's very hard to see because I think a lot of people are just really worried about the most immediate issues.
Yeah.
Is there going to be a war? Is there going to be a financial meltdown? You just look at gold and silver and platinum and palladium prices. It's just they're heading for the moon. And
they're finding all these safe havens.
So I think people are really worried. And I think people are worried about their jobs, worried about what's going to happen from 1 month to 1 year to the next.
Yeah, right. So it's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, and that really preys on people's minds, and quite rightly. Yeah.
I don't blame people for putting climate change on the back seat, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people know it's a real issue. It's a worrying issue. And I think a lot of people do worry about the loss of nature. They may not feel they can do anything about it, but it sort of sticks in the back of your mind that things are changing around them. But unless you can hear people talking about it, see politicians talking about it, it never really comes properly front of mind. And then people then focus on the more immediate issues. So I think people care. I think they know it's there. And when you see this incredible series of heat waves in southern Australia, for example, I mean, record temperatures, wildfires and so forth. And
what's happening with disasters around the world in other parts as well.
Yeah, I mean, the big freeze in the US, for example, and elsewhere.
Cyclones in Sri Lanka, typhoons in Philippines, flooding in Aceh. I think all of that would definitely go some ways in pushing climate change back front and center. But the problem is now, people react. There's no longer that proactive approach to climate change. And I think that is one of the third big shifts that we saw, right? Other than reframing of issues, moving away from multilateralism to bilateralism, there's also a movement away from science, away from data and long-term trends into just rhetoric and ideology, right? And that could be dangerous. But as you said, with climate change, there's so many cycles up and down. And perhaps what we are in now is also a cycle that mirrors this global interest in climate change and doing something about it. Hopefully, we won't stay in this, ice age in a way for too long.
I think the science part to me is really important because that is our constant. This sets the benchmark for what we know to be as real as it can be. Ideology comes and goes, but the hard work that scientists do, they set the basic foundations of our knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's good to see that despite the efforts to override the IPCC and other UN bodies, that there is a real effort by others, including philanthropy. So Mike Bloomberg, even Bill Gates, they have put in billions of dollars over the years to look on climate. And I think Mike Bloomberg has put in quite a lot of money to partially subsidize the loss of funding from the US. So to me, there is hope. So as long as we can keep that science foundation strong, even if we don't hear much about it, as long as it's continuing, that gives me some hope. But
I mean, look at what's happening even on the vaccine front.
Yeah, but that's just mainly the US though. That's
true. It's just that, all of this has been, whatever the US is doing has been so amplified.
Well, I mean, that's probably a subject for a different podcast, but there is a real debate and a genuine debate as to, is the US actually far from pushing itself, making itself like the most powerful economy? I mean, it already is, right? And the superpower to make it even stronger. In fact, the long-term implications could be that actually by defunding a lot of these or withdrawing from a lot of these bodies, that its stature in the world is going to shrink. And people will and already you see this in trade. People are sort of, countries looking elsewhere to do.
I mean, traditional allies have been totally sidelined. So I'm sure in the long term, many countries will factor this consideration in evaluating long-term relationships with the US.
Yeah, so in fact, the US will shrink. It'll still be a powerful economy, but it won't be perhaps the one that everybody looks up to and relies on, because people have to adapt.
Yeah. So what's your assessment, David, on whether current geopolitics and the way they are reshaping conversations on sustainability, good or bad, for overall push to continue the good fight?
Oh, absolutely, we must. But we don't know what's around the corner. We don't know if the US is going to attack Iran, what that could lead to. Will it just be something short and sharp like it was back in June 2025, or will it totally spiral out of control? This is the world we live in. So it's hard to say. But in terms of how we approach climate and nature loss, we must keep these issues, if nothing else, just to serve the public, to remind the people. And the key way to do that, I think, is to keep looking at the human angle, the human impacts, how people are adapting, how governments also doing their bit, and what their policies, what impact they're having, what new policies they might come up with, and business too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of people seem to think that, businesses don't care about climate change or sustainability. Well, that's not true. Some of them might not be quite as vocal. I mean, there's this thing called green hushing, where companies are quietly trying to meet their net zero targets, trying to
and
clean
their
up
compliance
their
obligations.
Yeah, but they just don't want to shout about it anymore. So they go quiet. And there are others, again, that are well-managed companies that look beyond 4 or 5 years to 10 or 20 years. And they can see the threat from climate change to their supply chains and also to nature loss. So they're looking at ways to minimize those impacts, to change their practices. I think that is still going on. It just doesn't get much coverage in the headlines.
Yeah. I think for me, what all this shows is that as communicators, we also need to change our approach to telling these stories. I mean, in the past, we do rely a lot on, direct reporting from scientific reports and so on. But I think that now has a shift not because I don't think that it's important, but because the reader attention is just so grabbed by so many other things that's going on in this world. So I think telling human stories, making sure that people understand that climate change has human impacts is equally important. And I would say also to continue highlighting good stories, highlighting stories that show people actually doing something, and it's not that people have totally forgotten about climate change or nature conservation and so on.
Yeah. Individuals and groups, definitely. Community groups, grassroots action. I think that to me is really important. And the work of companies as well. A genuine, not greenwashing stuff, but the real plugging away, this is what we're doing, and we're not paying attention to all the negativity coming from another country. This is what we want to do. This is the direction we're heading, and this is how we're doing it.
Yeah. So I think that's a good note to end off on. I mean, this is not one of our more upbeat episodes, but I think it's timely that we talk about this now. That's a wrap for this episode of Green Pulse. Once again, I'm Audrey Tan.
And I'm David Fogarty. You can email us your thoughts on this episode. Links to our articles and how to connect with us on social media are in our show notes. This episode was edited by Hadu Rahim.
And if you would like to keep abreast of Straits Times coverage of environmental issues, don't miss following us on our LinkedIn newsletter after the same name, Green Pulse, as well. Thank you for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.